The Mafia boss's deaf son stayed silent until the Black Maid finally reached him. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to Victor Romano. Silence had become the most expensive problem money could not solve, and in Victor Romano's mansion, silence was everywhere. It filled the wide hallways lined with imported marble, settled into the high ceilings above crystal chandeliers, and lingered most painfully behind one closed door at the end of the second floor. That door belonged to Ethan Romano, Victor's 7-year-old son, a child who had not spoken a single word in over 2 years. Doctors had come and gone, their tailored suits replaced by lab coats, their confident predictions fading into cautious silence. Specialists tested hearing, cognition, reflexes, and response, filling charts and whiteboards with notes that promised progress but delivered none. Victor paid every invoice without looking at the numbers. In his world, problems bowed to resources and obstacles disappeared when enough pressure was applied. But Ethan remained untouched by all of it. The boy sat by the window most days, small hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on something no one else could see. He did not turn when his name was signed or spoken. He did not flinch at slammed doors or raised voices. He simply existed, distant and unreachable, as if the world had stopped just short of him. Victor watched from doorways and security monitors, a man feared across the city reduced to a quiet observer in his own home. He could command rooms without raising his voice, negotiate outcomes with a glance, and end conflicts before they began, yet none of that mattered when it came to his son. Power had no language here. Authority had no meaning. Every night, after the house settled and the staff retreated into the background where they belonged, Victor stood outside Ethan's room, listening to nothing, hoping for something. That was when Lena Brooks first noticed the silence too. She was hired to clean, to move quietly through the mansion without leaving a trace, to be efficient and invisible. She wiped fingerprints from glass railings, folded blankets no one used, and returned toys to shelves they never left. She did not ask questions. She did not linger. But she noticed patterns others missed. She noticed how Ethan's eyes followed the movement of light instead of people, how his fingers tapped softly against the floor in careful rhythms, how he stiffened when approached from behind. Most of all, she noticed that no one ever sat beside him. They stood over him, spoke at him, waited for him, but never joined him. One afternoon, while the rest of the house moved on schedules and signals, Lena paused at the doorway. She did not call out. She did not step closer. She simply lowered herself to the floor, leaving space between herself and the boy, placing a single wooden block on the rug and letting it rest there. Ethan did not look at her. He did not react. But he did not move away either. And somewhere beyond the cameras, beyond the expectations, and beyond the reach of money, something quietly began to shift. The following days revealed just how thoroughly Ethan had been measured, categorized, and misunderstood. Every morning followed a schedule precise down to the minute, designed by experts who believed consistency would unlock something hidden inside him. At 8 o'clock sharp, a specialist arrived with flashcards and laminated charts. At 9, a therapist encouraged eye contact using brightly colored toys. At 10, another professional sat across from him, speaking slowly and clearly, waiting for reactions that never came. Ethan complied without resistance, but also without engagement, his small body present while his attention drifted elsewhere. Victor watched these sessions from behind glass or from the far corner of the room, arms crossed, jaw tight, his expression unreadable even to those who worked for him. Every report ended the same way, with phrases like limited response, minimal progress, and continued observation. Victor nodded, signed the paperwork, and dismissed them, each time feeling the weight of expectation press harder against his chest. He had built his life on control, on outcomes that could be predicted and enforced, yet here was his son, living proof that some things refused to bend. In quieter moments, when the house was still and the professionals had gone, Victor attempted his own version of connection. He sat across from Ethan at the long dining table, placing his phone aside, resisting the urge to multitask, forcing himself to remain still. He signed Ethan's name the way he had been taught, slow and deliberate, his large hands clumsy with unfamiliar movements. Ethan did not look up. Victor tried again the next evening, then the next. Each attempt met with the same gentle indifference. There was no rejection in it, no anger, just absence, and that absence unsettled Victor more than any threat ever had. Meanwhile, Lena continued her work as she always had, careful not to disrupt the rhythms of the house. She cleaned around therapy equipment, sanitized surfaces, and folded blankets that smelled faintly of lavender. She noticed how Ethan relaxed once the sessions ended, how his shoulders lowered when the room emptied, how his breathing steadied when the lights dimmed. She noticed too how Victor lingered nearby, never interrupting, never approaching, as if afraid to fracture something already fragile. One afternoon, when the specialists left early and the house slipped into an unexpected quiet, Lena found Ethan alone on the floor again, tracing the pattern of the rug with his fingers. She did not speak. She did not announce herself. She remembered what she had learned years ago, long before this job, long before this house, about the power of patience. She moved slowly, deliberately, making sure he could see her every step. She sat several feet away, her posture relaxed, her gaze soft but unfixed, and began arranging a small row of blocks by color, red to blue, blue to green, green to yellow. There was no instruction, no expectation. Time stretched. Ethan shifted slightly. His fingers paused. For a brief moment, his eyes flicked toward the pattern she was making before returning to the rug. It was a small thing, almost nothing, the kind of movement most people would miss entirely. But Lena noticed, and she stayed exactly where she was. Across the hall, unseen and silent, Victor stood still, watching a version of his son he had never been allowed to see, not because he lacked access, but because he had never known how to simply wait. Over the next week, subtle changes began to surface, the kind that did not announce themselves but altered the air in the room all the same. Ethan's routines remained intact, the specialists continued their visits, and the reports still spoke in careful, clinical language, yet something beneath the surface had shifted. During sessions, Ethan's gaze wandered less. His fingers no longer tapped restlessly against his knees. He did not engage in the ways the charts demanded, but he lingered, staying present a few seconds longer than before. Victor noticed these differences immediately. He had learned to read fluctuations in markets and moods, to detect weakness and opportunity in half a glance. And now that same instinct was trained on his son. Still, he said nothing. He had learned the hard way that pressure caused retreat. Lena, on the other hand, continued exactly as she was. She arrived early, moved quietly, and kept her interactions simple. When Ethan sat by the window, she joined him on the floor at a respectful distance. When he lined up toys, she mirrored the patterns without correcting or redirecting. She never touched him unless he moved closer first, and she never spoke unless necessary. There were moments when she signed simple words into the space between them, not expecting a response, just offering them like options. Ethan watched her hands more than her face, his eyes tracking the slow, deliberate motions. One afternoon, as rain traced thin lines down the glass, Ethan reached for a block and placed it beside hers, aligning it carefully with the others. Lena did not react. She did not smile or nod or praise him. She simply added another block, matching his pace, allowing the silence to remain unbroken. That restraint mattered more than any technique. From the hallway, Victor paused mid-step, his phone forgotten in his hand. He had seen professionals celebrate far smaller gestures, had watched them lean forward with anticipation that sent Ethan shrinking back. This was different. Nothing was being demanded. Nothing was being claimed. Later that evening, after the staff had cleared the main floor and the house dimmed into its nighttime quiet, Victor reviewed security footage, something he rarely did outside of necessity. He watched Lena and Ethan from a distance, observing the patience in her posture, the absence of urgency in her movements. There was no strategy here, no measurable goal, just time and presence. Victor felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest, a realization he had resisted until now. He had been surrounding his son with effort, with expertise, with urgency, but never with stillness. The next morning, Victor made a small adjustment that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. He instructed the household staff to give Lena uninterrupted time during the afternoons, no additional tasks, no redirections. He canceled one therapy session without explanation. When questioned, he simply said the schedule needed flexibility. Lena learned of the change indirectly, noticing the absence of the usual visitors and the unexpected calm that followed. She did not ask why. She simply continued. That day, as sunlight pooled across the rug, Ethan did something he had never done before. He leaned slightly toward her, not touching, but closing the space between them. His shoulder hovered inches from hers, his presence tentative but deliberate. Lena stayed still, her breathing slow, her hands resting open on her knees. After a long moment, Ethan lifted his hand and copied one of her earlier signs, imperfect but unmistakable. It was a word he had never been asked to say, a concept never tested. It meant here. From the doorway, Victor watched, his breath caught somewhere between disbelief and gratitude. He did not step forward. He did not interrupt. For the first time since his son had gone silent, Victor understood that reaching Ethan was not about breaking through a wall, but about waiting long enough for a door to open on its own. The change did not announce itself with celebration or certainty, but it reshaped the rhythm of the house all the same. The afternoons grew quieter, not empty, but intentional, as if the mansion itself had learned to pause. Ethan's therapy room remained untouched, the charts still pinned to the walls, yet no one stood beside them with a clipboard anymore. Instead, the floor by the window became the center of his world. Lena arrived each day with the same calm presence, never early, never late, her movements steady and predictable. She understood now that Ethan was listening in his own way, watching patterns rather than faces, responding to intention instead of instruction. She placed objects carefully, always within reach, but never pushed toward him, allowing choice to exist without consequence. Ethan responded with small shifts that only patience could detect. He stayed longer. He leaned in closer. He copied gestures more often, his hands moving hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. Victor watched these moments from a distance, resisting every instinct to intervene. He had canceled meetings without explanation, postponed decisions that once would have demanded his immediate attention. Those who worked for him noticed the change, but did not question it. They had learned that when Victor Romano was silent, it was best not to fill the space. One evening, Victor sat alone in his study, reviewing old footage of Ethan as a toddler, laughing without sound, clapping his hands in delight. The memories were sharp and unsettling, not painful, but heavy with realization. He had mistaken silence for absence, believing that if Ethan did not respond the way others expected, then nothing was happening at all. Watching Lena sit with his son had shown him otherwise. Something was always happening. It simply required the right kind of attention. The next day, Victor did something he had avoided for years. He joined them. He did not approach directly or speak. He lowered himself to the floor several feet away, mirroring Lena's posture, placing his hands flat against his knees. Ethan noticed immediately. His body tensed, his focus flickering between the familiar calm of Lena and the unfamiliar presence of his father at eye level. Victor did not reach out. He did not sign. He waited. The seconds stretched, uncomfortable and uncertain, until Ethan shifted back toward Lena, reassured by her stillness. Victor felt the urge to withdraw, to remove himself from the moment before he caused harm. But Lena glanced briefly in his direction and offered a small nod. Not permission, but encouragement. Victor remained where he was. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Ethan adjusted again, his attention widening to include both of them. He placed a block between Lena and Victor, a quiet bridge connecting the space. Victor's breath caught. He kept his hands still, his expression neutral, allowing the moment to exist without claiming it. That night, Victor lay awake longer than usual, replaying the scene with an intensity that surprised him. He realized then that his role was not to lead or fix, but to learn, to follow the pace his son set rather than the one the world demanded. Over the following days, Victor continued to join them, never for long, never imposing, always leaving before the rhythm was disrupted. Ethan grew accustomed to his presence, no longer stiffening at the soundless weight of his father nearby. He began to anticipate Victor's arrival, glancing toward the doorway at the usual time, his expectations. Quiet but clear. Lena noticed this too, and she adjusted, guiding without directing, allowing space for connection to form naturally. The house responded in subtle ways. Conversations lowered. Movement slowed. Even the light seemed gentler in the afternoons. It was not a transformation driven by authority or fear, but by something far more fragile and far more powerful, the understanding that trust, once broken or never formed, could not be commanded into existence, only invited and patiently earned. By the second week of shared afternoons, the change in Ethan was no longer something that could be dismissed as coincidence. He began to anticipate the quiet ritual, adjusting his position on the rug before Lena even reached the floor, leaving space where he expected her to sit. His movements grew more intentional, less guarded, as if the room itself had become familiar territory rather than a place he endured. Victor noticed how Ethan's shoulders no longer tightened when footsteps approached, how his focus no longer fractured at the presence of another person nearby. The boy still did not speak, still lived within a silence few could understand, but it was no longer sealed. It was selective. It was shared. Lena continued to respect the boundaries Ethan set, offering consistency rather than control. She introduced small variations, a new object placed among the familiar blocks, a different pattern traced slowly with her fingers. Each time, she waited, allowing Ethan to decide whether to follow or ignore her lead. More often than not, he followed. Victor watched these interactions with a mixture of restraint and awe, recognizing a discipline far different from his own. This was not patience enforced by strategy, but patience rooted in humility. One afternoon, something unexpected happened. As Lena signed a simple phrase she had used many times before, Ethan paused, his eyes narrowing in concentration. He studied her hands, then lifted his own, hesitating as if testing the weight of the moment. Slowly, deliberately, he repeated the sign back to her, his fingers clumsy but sincere. It was not a word of need or request, but a statement. It meant stay. Lena did not respond immediately. She let the sign linger between them, honoring its significance by not rushing to fill it with reaction. When she finally nodded, her expression calm, Ethan exhaled, a soft release that carried more meaning than sound ever could. Victor, watching from a few feet away, felt something give way inside him. He had spent years demanding loyalty, respect, and obedience, believing them to be measures of connection. Here, connection arrived without force, without expectation, and without recognition beyond the moment itself. That evening, Victor made another quiet decision. He instructed the household to permanently reduce outside visits, keeping only those specialists who demonstrated genuine adaptability. He did not frame it as rebellion against expertise, but as alignment with progress. He trusted what he had seen. In the days that followed, Ethan's engagement deepened. He began to initiate interactions, placing objects in Lena's hands, inviting her into his patterns rather than merely observing them. When Victor joined, Ethan no longer treated him as an intrusion. He acknowledged his presence with a brief glance, sometimes offering a block or gesturing toward an open space beside him. Victor accepted these invitations with care, mindful not to claim more than was offered. He learned to mirror rather than lead, to respond rather than direct. The house adapted around them, its rigid structure softening in response to the subtle shift at its core. Conversations became quieter. Schedules grew flexible. There was an unspoken understanding that this fragile progress required protection, not from danger, but from impatience. One late afternoon, as sunlight faded into a warm amber glow, Ethan did something that left both Lena and Victor still. He reached out and touched Victor's sleeve, not pulling, not seeking attention, simply making contact. The gesture was brief, almost tentative, but it carried weight. Victor did not move. He did not speak. He allowed the moment to exist exactly as it was, understanding instinctively that to demand more would be to lose everything. In that touch, Victor recognized the truth he had resisted for so long. His son had never been unreachable. He had simply been waiting for someone willing to meet him where he was, without urgency, without judgment, and without fear. The moment lingered long after Ethan withdrew his hand, as if the space between father and son had been quietly marked. Victor did not move until Ethan returned his attention to the blocks, resuming the familiar rhythm that grounded him. Only then did Victor allow himself to breathe, careful not to disrupt what had just occurred. He understood now that progress did not arrive in dramatic gestures, but in fragile increments that demanded restraint. Lena sensed the shift as well. She adjusted her pace even further, slowing movements that were already gentle, giving Ethan room to process what connection felt like when it was freely offered rather than prompted. Over the next few days, Ethan began initiating moments with greater confidence. He would place an object deliberately closer to Victor, then glance briefly in his direction, checking for reaction. Victor responded by mirroring Lena's calm, keeping his posture open and his attention steady. There was no instruction exchanged, no expectation imposed, only a shared understanding that presence was enough. Lena introduced a new element one afternoon, something she had considered carefully before bringing into the space. She signed a simple phrase, one she had avoided until now, waiting until Ethan demonstrated readiness. The sign was slow, deliberate, and repeated with consistency. It meant you were safe. Ethan watched intently, his eyes tracing the motion of her hands. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached out and pressed his palm flat against the floor, grounding himself. Minutes passed. Lena remained still. Victor felt the familiar pull of anticipation but resisted it, anchoring himself in patience. Then, with careful precision, Ethan lifted his hands and repeated the sign, not perfectly, but clearly enough to be understood. The air in the room seemed to hold its breath. Lena nodded once, her expression unchanged, honoring the moment without elevating it beyond what Ethan could sustain. Victor felt his throat tighten, not from sadness, but from a realization that altered something fundamental within him. His son was not broken. He was deliberate. He was choosing when and how to engage, and now he was choosing them. That evening, Victor declined a call he would have once considered non-negotiable. He sat instead in the dimmed living room, replaying the day in his mind, recognizing how close he had come to missing this entirely by insisting on outcomes rather than understanding. Over the following week, Ethan's communication expanded subtly. He began using the signs Lena had introduced to express simple states: tired, here, more. Each sign was offered without demand, received without fanfare. Victor learned alongside him, practicing in private, then carefully incorporating what he had learned into their shared time. He discovered that learning from his son required a humility he had never practiced before, a willingness to be corrected by silence and guided by observation. The house continued to adapt, its energy softening around this evolving dynamic. Staff members adjusted their movements instinctively, avoiding sudden interruptions, speaking less and observing more. There was a growing sense that something important was unfolding, something that could not be rushed or replicated. One afternoon, as clouds drifted slowly past the windows, Ethan surprised them both. He signed a word unprompted, a word Lena had never taught him directly, but had used in his presence often. It meant father. The sign was small, tentative, but unmistakable. Victor froze, afraid that even blinking might undo it. Lena remained still, allowing Ethan to hold ownership of what he had expressed. Ethan did not look at Victor right away. He focused instead on his hands, as if grounding himself in the act of communication. Then he glanced up, meeting his father's eyes for a brief, powerful moment. Victor did not respond with words. He signed back slowly, carefully, mirroring the gesture with respect rather than possession. In that exchange, something irrevocable shifted. Silence did not disappear, but it changed shape. It was no longer a barrier. It became a shared language, one that carried meaning without sound, trust without demand, and connection without force. After that exchange, Victor understood that the balance he had found was fragile, not because it could be lost easily, but because it demanded a version of himself he had never needed before. The world he controlled beyond the walls of his home operated on certainty and dominance, on clear hierarchies and unquestioned authority. Here, none of that applied. Ethan did not respond to power. He responded to presence, consistency, and respect. Victor adjusted accordingly, shedding habits that no longer served him. He stopped watching the clock during their afternoons together. He silenced his phone completely, not even glancing at it when it vibrated. He learned to sit without agenda, to observe without interpreting, to accept moments as they came rather than attempting to steer them. Lena noticed this change immediately. Victor no longer hovered at the edge of the room, unsure of his place. He belonged there now, not because he demanded it, but because Ethan allowed it. Their shared silence had become something purposeful, a space where communication unfolded without pressure. Ethan continued to expand his use of signs, sometimes repeating familiar ones, sometimes experimenting with new combinations. Lena followed his lead, introducing language only when it felt invited, reinforcing understanding. Without overwhelming him, Victor practiced each sign carefully, often alone at night, standing in front of a mirror, correcting the angle of his hands, the speed of his movements. He did not want to rush this learning, understanding that fluency was not measured in speed, but in sincerity. One afternoon, as clouds gathered outside and the lights softened, Ethan surprised them again. He reached out and tugged lightly at Victor's sleeve, then pointed toward the open floor space beside Lena. It was an invitation, deliberate and clear. Victor moved slowly, settling beside his son, careful to mirror the calm energy that had become their foundation. Ethan arranged the blocks in a new pattern, more complex than before, pausing occasionally to check their reactions. Lena observed quietly, allowing the dynamic between father and son to develop without interference. When Victor followed Ethan's pattern correctly, Ethan's eyes brightened, a subtle change that carried unmistakable meaning. It was not joy in the way most would recognize, but satisfaction, the quiet relief of being understood. Later that evening, Victor made a decision that would have significant consequences beyond his home. He restructured his schedule permanently, delegating responsibilities he once refused to release. Those around him noticed the shift, the way his priorities had reordered themselves without explanation. He did not offer one. He understood now that what mattered most required his full attention, not in brief windows, but as a commitment woven into his life. Over the next several days, Ethan began initiating signs that reflected emotional states: content, uncertain, tired. Each expression was received without correction, allowing him ownership of his experience. Victor responded by acknowledging each sign, not with solutions, but with presence. When Ethan signed tired, Victor adjusted the environment, dimming the lights, reducing stimulation. When he signed uncertain, Victor remained close, offering reassurance through proximity rather than words. Lena continued to guide subtly, reinforcing this responsive approach, ensuring that Ethan's communication was met with respect rather than urgency. The house itself seemed to settle into this new rhythm, as if recognizing the importance of what was unfolding. Staff members moved with heightened awareness, understanding that the smallest disruption could fracture the trust being built. There was a shared unspoken agreement to protect this space. One quiet afternoon, as rain fell softly against the windows, Ethan did something neither of them expected. He signed a phrase slowly, carefully, one sign at a time. It was simple, yet profound. It meant stay with me. Victor felt his chest tighten, not with fear or uncertainty, but with clarity. He signed back without hesitation, his movement steady and assured. It meant I am here. In that exchange, Victor recognized the depth of the transformation taking place. This was not a moment of triumph, but of alignment, the understanding that true connection required surrendering control and allowing trust to grow at its own pace. For the first time, Victor did not feel the urge to change anything. He understood that this, exactly as it was enough. In the weeks that followed, the changes within the house became unmistakable, not because they were dramatic, but because they endured. Ethan's afternoons were no longer isolated moments carved out from the rest of his life, but the foundation upon which everything else adjusted. He began carrying his sense of safety beyond the rug by the window, bringing it into meals, into shared spaces, into the quiet routines that once overwhelmed him. He did not suddenly become expressive in ways others expected, but he became present, his attention anchored rather than drifting. Victor noticed how Ethan now sought proximity rather than retreat, choosing to sit nearby during meals, reaching for familiar objects when uncertainty surfaced. Victor responded by reshaping the environment rather than expecting adaptation, lowering noise, reducing visual clutter, allowing calm to lead rather than follow. Lena remained a steady presence, her role evolving naturally without formal acknowledgement. She was no longer simply cleaning around moments of connection. She was part of the rhythm itself. Ethan looked for her when afternoons approached, his expectations quiet but consistent. She continued to honor his autonomy, introducing language gently, reinforcing understanding through repetition and respect. Victor watched this dynamic with deepening awareness, recognizing that Lena had not inserted herself into Ethan's world, but had allowed Ethan to invite her in. That distinction mattered more than any credential. One morning, Victor made a decision that formalized what had already become true. He met with his household staff and redefined Lena's role, not elevating her status publicly, not framing it as reward or promotion, but ensuring her presence was protected and prioritized. He did not speak of gratitude or obligation. He simply ensured that what mattered was preserved. Lena accepted the change with the same quiet dignity she brought to everything else, understanding that the work itself was the point, not recognition. Ethan sensed the stability immediately. His interactions grew more confident, his use of signs expanding to include preferences and boundaries. He signed when he wanted to be alone and when he wanted company. Each expression was met with respect, reinforcing his sense of control over his world. Victor learned to read these cues with increasing fluency, adjusting his responses accordingly. He discovered that listening did not always involve sound or even sight, but attention, the kind that did not seek to fix or resolve, only to understand. The house adapted further, its rigid structure giving way to flexibility guided by Ethan's needs. Schedules softened. Expectations shifted. What once felt like accommodation now felt like alignment. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the windows, Ethan initiated something new. He signed a sequence slowly, carefully, combining words he had learned over time. It was not perfect, but it was clear. It expressed comfort, presence, and belonging. Victor watched Lena receive the message with calm affirmation, then turned to him, allowing Ethan to direct the flow of communication. Ethan looked between them, ensuring they understood, then settled back against the cushions, his body relaxed in a way it had never been before. Victor felt the weight of that moment settle within him, not as triumph, but as responsibility. He understood now that this connection was not an achievement to be claimed, but a relationship to be tended. Silence still existed in their home, but it no longer felt empty or heavy. It had become intentional, a space where meaning unfolded without demand. As evening approached and the house settled into its familiar quiet, Victor sat beside his son, no longer wondering what to do next. He understood that the work was not about progress measured in milestones, but about showing up consistently, meeting Ethan where he was, and honoring the dignity of a child who had always been listening, waiting for the world to learn how to listen back. The shift in Ethan became most visible not in what he added to his world, but in what he no longer feared. Mornings unfolded with less hesitation, his body moving through the house with quiet confidence rather than caution. He chose where to sit, what to hold, and who to be near, his decisions guided by an inner clarity that had been absent before. Victor noticed how his son now initiated small connections throughout the day, offering a block during breakfast, signing a preference before discomfort set in, glancing toward familiar faces rather than withdrawing inward. These were not dramatic milestones, but they carried a steady certainty that could not be undone. Lena continued her role with the same humility that had defined her from the beginning. She did not claim responsibility for the changes, nor did she attempt to shape what came next. She understood that her presence had simply created space, and that Ethan had done the rest himself. Victor watched her work with a respect that did not require words. He understood now that influence did not always announce itself, and that the most profound shifts often occurred beyond recognition. One evening, as the house settled into its familiar quiet, Ethan signed something new, something he had never expressed before. It was simple and deliberate, a combination of signs that conveyed calm and closeness. Victor watched Lena acknowledge it gently, then turned to him, allowing Ethan to guide the interaction. Ethan looked up at his father and placed his hand against Victor's arm, not as a test, but as a statement. Victor responded by signing back slowly, his movements steady, his attention fully present. There was no rush to interpret, no attempt to expand the moment beyond what it was. It existed exactly as it needed to. In that stillness, Victor understood the transformation that had taken place. He had entered this journey believing his son needed to be reached, to be brought back from silence. What he learned instead was that Ethan had always been there, communicating in ways the world had not taken the time to understand. The silence had never been emptiness. It had been a language waiting to be respected. Over time, the household adjusted permanently, its priorities reshaped around this truth. Noise became optional. Attention became intentional. Presence replaced performance. Victor carried this understanding beyond his home, altering the way he approached every interaction, every decision. He no longer measured strength by dominance or volume, but by the ability to listen without insisting on response. One afternoon, as sunlight filled the room and Ethan sat comfortably between Lena and Victor, the boy signed a phrase that required no translation. It conveyed safety, trust, and belonging all at once. Victor felt the weight of it settle deep within him, not as pride, but as responsibility. He placed his hand beside his son's, not covering it, not directing it, simply aligning with it. In that quiet alignment, the meaning was clear. Power had not solved what patience did. Authority had not achieved what humility allowed. And the most important lesson Victor Romano would ever learn arrived not through words or sound, but through the steady, unwavering truth of a child who had finally been met where he stood. That day, without ceremony or applause, the world remembered what dignity looked like.